During World War II, the Nazis established concentration camps throughout Europe where they committed some of the darkest atrocities in history. Among the perpetrators of these acts were female guards, notorious for their extreme cruelty and abuse of power. However, justice eventually caught up with many of them. Jenny Wanda Barkman met her end at the gallows. Ilse Koch took her own life, while Hermine Braunsteiner lived out her days behind iron bars. These are the fates of women who wielded power to destroy and paid the ultimate price. Maria Mandl. Auschwitz was a concentration camp full of unimaginable horror. Over 1 million prisoners passed through its gates, most of them never leaving alive. The air was heavy with fear and death, and survival was a daily battle. The guards were merciless, the punishments brutal, and death seemed to linger in every corner. Among those who held power here was Maria Mandl, one of the highest-ranking female guards. Maria Mandl, known as the Beast, arrived at Auschwitz with authority and cruelty to match. She was responsible for thousands of lives, and it was her decisions that sent many of them to their deaths. The sound of her boots clicking on the gravel struck terror in the hearts of prisoners. She carried out selections personally, walking the rows of trembling prisoners, pointing out women and children to be sent to the gas chambers. Her presence alone was enough to drain hope from those who saw her. Under her rule, the tortures were relentless. Prisoners were beaten, worked to exhaustion, and starved. Maria made sure the camp functioned efficiently, which meant death for those who couldn't keep up. The weaker ones were dealt with swiftly, disposed of in the gas chambers or by other means. But the war didn't last forever, and neither did Maria's reign. She was captured after the war and put on trial for her crimes. Her role in the systematic murder of thousands was undeniable, and the court sentenced her to death. On January 24, 1948, Maria Mandl faced her execution. She was led to the gallows, her hands tightly bound. The noose was placed around her neck as she stood silently. With a pull of the lever, the trapdoor opened, and Maria Mandl's body dropped. Her life, filled with power and cruelty, came to an abrupt end. Although Maria Mandl faced execution for her crimes, her case is just one example of how justice was served to those responsible for unimaginable atrocities. Irma Grese. Have you ever heard of someone so young and beautiful, yet so feared that her name alone sent shivers down people's spines? Irma Grese was just 19 when she stepped into Auschwitz as a senior SS guard, but her actions were anything but innocent. She walked with an air of authority, her whip in one hand and her dogs close by, ready to attack at her command. Irma never flinched as she sent men, women, and children to their deaths. She stood by during the selections, her hand pointing left or right, deciding who would live and who would face the gas chambers. Her face was cold, her decisions quick and final. She was later transferred to Ravensbrück, but nothing about her changed. In fact, it only got worse. She continued to beat prisoners mercilessly with her whip, and her punishments were as harsh as one could imagine. Irma carried on with the same determination, enforcing her authority over those who couldn't resist. But when the war ended, Irma's time ran out. She was captured, put on trial, and sentenced to death. On December 13, 1945, she was led to the gallows. She walked calmly to the platform, her hands tied tightly behind her back. The noose was placed around her neck, adjusted carefully by the executioner. Without delay, the trapdoor opened beneath her feet, and Irma Grese was gone. Irma Grese's execution was a notable moment of justice, but her story is not the only one that shows accountability for such terrible crimes. Elsa Erich. Elsa Erich was born in 1914 in Wuppertal, Germany. Before the war, she lived an ordinary life, working as a secretary. But in 1940, she joined the SS and trained as a guard. Her rise in rank was quick, and she became an Oberaufseherin, or chief overseer, with significant power in the camps where she was stationed. By the time she arrived at Majdanek, she had embraced her role completely. At Majdanek, Erich's position put her in charge of women prisoners. She was responsible for overseeing daily labor, punishing those who disobeyed, and participating in selections for the gas chambers. Her cold attitude and strict enforcement of the rules made her feared by everyone under her watch. During selections, she stood by as prisoners were lined up, choosing who was too weak or sick to continue. Her gestures sent countless women and children to their deaths. Elsa was also involved in mistreatment beyond the selections. Beatings and physical punishment were common under her authority. She ensured the prisoners worked to exhaustion, knowing many wouldn't survive the harsh conditions. After the war, Elsa Erich was arrested and put on trial in Poland. Witnesses described her actions in detail, and her role in the murders at Majdanek sealed her fate. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. On October 26, 1948, Elsa Erich faced her execution in Lublin, Poland. She walked to the gallows in silence. The noose was placed around her neck, and with the pull of the lever, the trapdoor opened. In that moment, Elsa Erich's life ended, leaving behind the shadow of her crimes at Majdanek. While Elsa Erich paid the ultimate price for her crimes, the next person received a punishment that was far less severe, but still carried consequences. Herta Botha. Ravensbrück was a camp of misery and despair, known as one of the most brutal places during the Holocaust. It held over 100,000 prisoners, most of them women. Prisoners there were subjected to harsh labor, starvation, and unspeakable punishments. The camp's guards were infamous for their cruelty, and among them was Herta Bota, a woman whose presence brought fear and pain. Herta Bota was known for her violent temper and her willingness to punish prisoners with extreme force. She patrolled the camp, her boots crunching on the gravel as her eyes searched for any excuse to lash out. A slow worker, a whispered word, or even a shaky step could bring her wrath. Prisoners were beaten severely, some to the brink of death. Her role in the selection process added to her reputation. She helped decide which prisoners were too weak to continue working and sent them away to be executed. Her behavior never softened. The suffering and cries of the prisoners didn't seem to affect her. Day after day, she carried out her duties without hesitation. When the war ended, Herta's actions didn't go unnoticed. She was captured and brought to trial. The evidence against her was clear, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Yet her punishment did not match the crime she committed. After serving only part of her sentence, she was released in 1958. Herta Bota lived out her life far from the horrors of Ravensbrück. She died on March 16, 2000, her past remaining a dark chapter in the story of the Holocaust. Herta Bota's prison sentence may seem mild compared to others, but the next individual faced a harsher punishment that reflected the seriousness of their actions. Ermine Braunsteiner. Majdanek was a camp where death felt like an ever-present shadow. It held thousands of prisoners at any given time, and many of them succumbed to starvation, executions, or the brutal labor imposed on them. Guards at Majdanek were known for their ruthless punishments, and Hermann Braunsteiner stood out even among them. She earned the nickname the Mayor of Majdanek for her violent treatment of prisoners. Braunsteiner had a habit of using her heavy boots to kick prisoners, often injuring or killing them. Her presence was dreaded in the camp, and she was directly involved in selections, deciding who would be sent to the gas chambers. She showed no hesitation or mercy as she ordered countless men, women, and children to their deaths. Her cruelty extended beyond the selections. She was known to beat prisoners to death and force others into marches they could not survive. After the war, Braunsteiner tried to escape justice. She fled Europe and lived quietly in the United States for years, but her past eventually caught up with her. In 1973, she was extradited to Germany to face trial for her crimes. The court heard extensive evidence of her brutality, and in 1981, she was sentenced to life imprisonment for her role in the deaths of thousands at Majdanek. Braunsteiner served only a portion of her sentence before being released in 1996 due to poor health. She died in 1999, far removed from the horrors of the concentration camps where she had once ruled with such cruelty. Her story remains one of the many dark chapters of the Holocaust. Hermann Braunsteiner's long sentence was significant, but the next person's punishment was even more severe, leaving no chance for release or freedom. Ilse Koch. Buchenwald was one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, where tens of thousands of prisoners suffered and died. Life in the camp was a nightmare of forced labor, starvation, and constant abuse. The guards ruled with brutality, but few names carried as much fear as Ilse Koch. She was called the Witch of Buchenwald, a nickname earned through her cruelty and strange fascination with human suffering. Ilse was married to Karl Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald, but she held her own place of authority in the camp. She would walk among the prisoners, observing them with a cold, calculating gaze. Her most horrifying act, according to testimonies, was selecting prisoners with distinctive tattoos. These prisoners were later killed, and their skin was allegedly turned into lampshades and other items for her collection. But her cruelty extended beyond the killings. She was known for punishing prisoners harshly for the smallest mistakes. Beatings, starvation, and mental torture were her tools, and she used them without remorse. Her actions left a deep mark on the memories of those who survived Buchenwald. After the war, Ilse Koch was captured and tried for her crimes. The accusations of using human skin as decoration shocked the world, though some of these claims were disputed during the trials. Still, her involvement in the camp's brutalities was undeniable. She was sentenced to life in prison, but her sentence was later reduced. Ilse Koch lived out her remaining years in prison, but on September 1st, 1967, she took her own life. She was found hanging in her cell, leaving behind a legacy of fear and the horrifying stories of her victims at Buchenwald. Ilse Koch's story ended in tragedy after her sentencing, but the next person's punishment came swiftly and was far less forgiving. Ruth Neudeck. Ravensbrück was no ordinary prison. It was a place designed to break the human spirit. Over 130,000 women and children were held there during the war. They were starved, beaten, and forced to work long hours in brutal conditions. Death was always close, whether through exhaustion, disease, or the gas chambers. Among the guards who enforced this nightmare was Ruth Neudeck, a name that struck fear into anyone who heard it. Ruth Neudeck was not just a guard. She carried out her duties with a level of violence that was terrifying to witness. Prisoners who moved too slowly or stumbled were beaten without hesitation. Her whip was a constant presence, and she didn't hold back when using it. Those who survived her punishments often bore the scars as a reminder of her rage. Neudeck was also involved involved in selecting prisoners for execution. She stood near the lines, pointing out the weak and sick for immediate death. Her decisions were quick and final, and she never looked back. But her role didn't end there. She helped supervise the construction of the gas chambers at Ravensbrück, ensuring that the machinery of death ran efficiently. When the war ended, Ruth Neudeck's reign of terror was over. She was captured and put on trial for her crimes. Testimonies and evidence left no doubt about her guilt. The court sentenced her to death. On July 29, 1948, Ruth Neudeck was led to the gallows. She walked with no resistance, her hands bound behind her back. The executioner placed the noose around her neck and pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened, and in an instant, Ruth Neudeck was gone. Ruth Neudeck faced execution for her actions, but the next person also received a similar punishment that reflected the seriousness of their crimes. Dorothea Binz. Dorothea Binz was only 19 when she began her career as a camp guard. Born in Germany in 1920, she had a modest upbringing and worked as a housemaid before joining the SS. By 1943, she was transferred to Ravensbrück, where she quickly rose through the ranks. Her youth might have suggested innocence, but her actions in the camp told a different story. She became the overseer of female prisoners. Known for her strict and violent methods, Dorothea seemed to thrive on the authority she wielded. Her punishments were harsh, and she used a leather whip to enforce her rules. Prisoners learned to fear her presence, as even a glance in the wrong direction could provoke her anger. What set Dorothea apart was the personal cruelty she inflicted. She often carried out beatings herself, ensuring the prisoners understood their place. Witnesses later described her as unrelenting, taking pleasure in their suffering. She also oversaw executions, standing by as lives were ended, her expression cold and unfeeling. When the war ended, Dorothea tried to disappear, but her name was already known. She was captured and brought to trial for her crimes at Ravensbrück. The court heard shocking accounts of her actions, and she showed no remorse as the evidence mounted against her. On May 2, 1947, Dorothea Binz was taken to the gallows. She walked to the platform without hesitation, her hands bound tightly behind her back. The noose was secured around her neck, and in a swift motion, the lever was pulled. The trapdoor opened, and Dorothea Binz was gone, leaving behind a legacy of terror that haunted the survivors of Ravensbrück. Dorothea Binz's death sentence sent a clear message, but the next case involved another execution that was equally significant in delivering justice. Gertrude Heise. The walls of Ravensbrück held stories of unimaginable pain. It wasn't just a camp, it was a place where hope went to die. Women and children were stuffed into overcrowded barracks, forced into hard labor, and starved until their bodies could no longer take it. Amid this chaos was Gertrude Heise, a guard who ensured the rules of cruelty were strictly followed. Heise patrolled the camp with a harsh, unrelenting attitude. Her voice carried commands that no one dared to disobey. Those who failed in their work or broke the oppressive rules were punished swiftly. Prisoners were dragged to her feet and beaten mercilessly, often left unable to stand after the blows. The punishments weren't the only thing that made Heise feared. She participated in the selections, the process of deciding who would live and who would die. As lines of women and children stood trembling, she would point out those deemed too weak to work, sealing their fates with a single motion. For many, Heise's face was the last thing they saw before being led to the gas chambers. When Ravensbrück was liberated, Gertrude Heise's crimes were not ignored. She was caught, and her trial revealed the cruel role she played in the camp. Unlike some others who were executed, Heise was sentenced to prison, 15 years, which was later reduced to 7. After her release, Gertrude Heise disappeared into silence. But for the survivors of Ravensbrück, the memory of her presence remained. Her voice, her punishments, and her decisions were etched into the minds of those who lived through the nightmare she helped create. While Gertrude Heise's sentence was lighter than others, the next individual faced a much harsher punishment that brought justice for their victims. Elisabeth Volkenrath. Elisabeth Volkenrath was not a name prisoners at Auschwitz could forget. She was always there, moving through the camp with a steady, deliberate pace. Her face was tough, her expression cold, and her presence enough to silence any whispers or glances among the prisoners. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words carried weight and punishment. Selections were her primary role. Prisoners were lined up, trembling, their fate hanging on a single gesture from her. Elizabeth would stand, her arms folded or resting at her sides, and with a sharp motion of her hand, lives were decided. Left meant life, though it was often only a temporary break from suffering. Right meant the gas chambers, death waiting only a short distance away. She never paused or hesitated, and her face never showed regret. By the end of the war, the control Elizabeth had enjoyed disappeared. She was captured, and the trial that followed laid her actions bare for all to see. Evidence and testimonies described her role clearly, and the verdict was inevitable: death by hanging. Morning of December 13, 1945, Elisabeth Volkenrath was taken to the gallows. She walked firmly, her hands bound behind her back. The executioner stood ready as she was positioned on the platform. The noose was tightened around her neck. There was no delay. The lever was pulled, the trapdoor opened, and Elisabeth Volkenrath's body fell through. In an instant, her life ended. Elisabeth Volkenrath's execution was carried out without delay, and the next person faced a punishment just as final for their involvement in these atrocities. Gerda Steinhoff. Gerda Steinhoff's path to the horrors of Stutthof began with a quiet life. Born in 1922, she grew up in Germany and worked as a housemaid and farm laborer before joining the Nazi regime. By 1944, she had become a camp guard, stationed at Stutthof, where her transformation into a figure of fear was swift and brutal. At just 22 years old, Gerda held a position of power over the prisoners. She quickly gained a reputation for her cruelty. Armed with a whip and a cold attitude, she carried out punishments that left prisoners broken in body and spirit. Those who failed to meet her demands were beaten relentlessly, often left unfit to continue the difficult work they were forced to perform. Her role didn't end with overseeing the prisoners. Gerda took part in the selections, deciding which prisoners were too weak or sick to continue living. She stood by as countless women and children were sent to the gas chambers, her hand pointing without hesitation. Her youth and outward beauty hid a ruthlessness that shocked even her fellow guards. When the war ended, Gerda was captured by Polish forces and put on trial in Gdansk, alongside other Stutthof guards. Witnesses recounted her brutal actions, and the court sentenced her to death for her crimes. On July 4, 1946, Gerda Steinhoff was led to the gallows. She stood silently as the noose was placed around her neck. The executioner worked quickly, pulling the lever that opened the trapdoor beneath her feet. In that single moment, the life of one of Stutthof's most brutal guards came to an end. Gerda Steinhoff's execution reflected the gravity of her actions, but the next person also faced the same punishment for crimes of a similar nature. Jenny Wanda Barkman. Stutthof was a place where survival was nearly impossible. Over 100,000 people were imprisoned there, and tens of thousands never made it out alive. Prisoners endured starvation, forced labor, and a constant threat of death. Among the guards who enforced this cruelty was Jenny Wanda Barkman, whose actions earned her the nickname Beautiful Spectre for her striking appearance and horrifying behavior. Jenny Wanda Barkman arrived at Stutthof as a young woman, but quickly proved she could be as ruthless as any of the guards. She was known for her sadistic punishments, taking pleasure in the suffering of the prisoners. Jenny Wanda carried out her duties with no trace of compassion. She ordered the beating of prisoners and forced them to work until they collapsed. She also played a direct role in the camp's executions. Barkman was often present during the selections, where prisoners were chosen for the gas chambers or other methods of death. Her presence alone filled prisoners with fear. She walked with confidence, never hesitating as lives were taken under her watch. But when the war ended, Barkman's time in power was over. She was captured and brought to trial in the first post-war trials in Gdansk, Poland. Witnesses testified to her brutality, and her actions left no doubt about her guilt. She was sentenced to death for her crimes. On July 4, 1946, Jenny Wanda Barkman was led to the gallows. She showed little emotion as she was escorted to the platform. The noose was placed around her neck, and the trapdoor opened beneath her feet. In that moment, the life of one of Stutthof's most feared guards came to an end. Jenny Wanda Barkman's fate was sealed with her execution, but the next story shows another individual who met the same end for their part in these events. Anneliese Kohlmann. Anneliese Kohlmann was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1921. She worked as a housekeeper before joining the ranks of the SS in her early 20s. In 1944, she was assigned to Stutthof, a camp infamous for its harsh conditions and high death toll. It was here that Kohlmann's name became associated with cruelty and suffering. Anneliese was known for her strict and violent control over the prisoners. She patrolled the camp with a harsh look, her whip always ready. Prisoners who failed to meet the demanding pace of forced labor often found themselves at her mercy, though there was little mercy to be found. Beatings were common, and the injured were left to fend for themselves with no medical care. Selections were part of her duties, where she decided who was fit to work and who would be sent to the gas chambers. She performed these tasks with a relaxed attitude, showing no remorse as she pointed out those marked for death. Her role in the camp's operations made her one of the most feared guards. When the war ended, Kohlmann tried to avoid capture, but was arrested in 1945. At her trial, survivors testified to the brutality she had inflicted. She was sentenced to prison for her crimes, serving her time before being released. Anneliese Kohlmann lived quietly after her release, but her past could not be erased. She died on September 17, 1977, leaving behind a history of cruelty and pain that still lingered in the memories of those who survived Stutthof. Anneliese Kohlmann avoided the death penalty, but the next person was not as fortunate and received a much harsher sentence for their actions. Elisabeth Becker. Elisabeth Becker grew up in a small German town and worked as a clerk before the war changed her life forever. In 1944, at the age of 22, she volunteered for training as an SS guard. Soon after, she was stationed at Stutthof, a camp known for its cruelty and the endless suffering of its prisoners. Becker quickly adapted to her new role. Her duties included supervising the prisoners and maintaining order during the hard forced labor, but her involvement in the camp's operations went beyond mere supervision. She became directly involved in selections, standing by as lines of terrified terrified women and children awaited her judgment. With a gesture of her hand, she decided who would live another day and who would be sent to the gas chambers. Despite her youth, Elizabeth carried out her role without emotion. She participated in punishments, ensuring that no one under her watch dared to step out of line. Prisoners came to dread her presence, knowing that her decisions often meant the difference between life and death. When the war ended, Becker was arrested and brought to trial alongside other Stutthof guards. The evidence against her was clear, and she offered no defense for her actions. The court sentenced her to death for her role in the mass killings. On July 4, 1946, Elizabeth Becker was led to the gallows at Biskupia Gorka. She remained quiet as the noose was placed around her neck. In one swift motion, the trapdoor opened beneath her feet, ending the life of one of Stutthof's many enforcers of terror. Elizabeth Becker faced her punishment on the gallows, but the next person's sentence also delivered a strong sense of justice for the crimes they committed. Herta Ehlert. Herta Ehlert's path to Ravensbrück began with a simple life. Born in Berlin in 1905, she worked as a baker before the war. By 1939, she joined the SS and began training as a camp guard. Her assignment to Ravensbrück marked the start of her role in one of the darkest chapters of history. At Ravensbrück, Ehlert was known for her strict and often violent control over prisoners. She patrolled the camp with a sharp eye, ensuring no rules were broken. Punishments were severe and handed out without hesitation. Prisoners who stumbled during their difficult tasks or broke the rigid rules were often beaten or deprived of what little food they were allowed. Herta was also involved in the selection processes, where prisoners were chosen for execution. She stood by as the weak and sick were pulled from the lines, showing no emotion as she carried out her duties. Her loyalty to the SS was unshaken, and she followed orders without question. When the war ended, Herta Ehlert was captured and tried for her actions. During the trial, evidence of her mistreatment of prisoners came to light, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her sentence was later reduced to 12 years, and she was released after serving her time. After her release, Ehlert lived quietly until her death on April 4, 1997. Though she avoided execution, the memory of her role at Ravensbrück remained tied to the suffering of those who endured the horrors of the camp. Herta Ehlert served a long prison term, but the next individual faced a much harsher punishment that left no possibility for freedom. Louise Dans. In 1943, Louise Dans found herself in a position of power for the first time in her life. She had joined the SS at the age of 26 and was sent to Ravensbrück, one of the most notorious concentration camps. Her life before this moment was unremarkable, working as a maid in her hometown, but at the camp, she became something else entirely. Danz's main duty was to oversee forced labor. The prisoners, most of them women, worked in unbearable conditions, building infrastructure or sewing uniforms for the war effort. If someone slowed down or made a mistake, Louise did not hesitate to punish them. Her punishments were harsh, often leaving prisoners too weak to continue. She seemed to take pride in her authority, walking the camp with a watchful eye and an unforgiving presence. Selections were also part of her responsibilities. She stood with other guards as prisoners were lined up, deciding who was fit to work and who would be sent away. Those deemed unfit were taken to the gas chambers. Dans did not flinch or hesitate during these moments. Her decisions were swift and final, sealing the fates of countless lives. After the war, Danz's actions came to light. She was arrested and stood trial for her role in the camp's horrors. The court sentenced her to life imprisonment in 1947. However, she received amnesty and was released in 1957. Louise Dans lived out her days quietly, but her past remained a shadow over her life. For the survivors of Ravensbrück, her name was a reminder of the cruelty they endured. Louise Dans eventually had her sentence reduced, but the next case shows someone who faced far stricter consequences without any leniency. Elfriede Rinkel. Elfriede Rinkel's life after the war seemed ordinary. She lived in California, worked as a housekeeper, and was known to neighbors as a polite and quiet woman. But before all of that, she was a guard at Ravensbrück, and her role there was anything but quiet. At the camp, she was one of the many guards tasked with maintaining control over the prisoners. What set her apart was her use of trained dogs as tools of terror. Prisoners at Ravensbrück lived in constant fear of Rinkel. She patrolled the camp with her dogs, which were trained to attack on her command. Survivors later described the animals being used to maul prisoners who fell behind in their tasks or disobeyed orders. For the inmates, even a slight misstep could mean facing the wrath of Rinkel and her dogs. Unlike many other guards, Rinkel did not face justice immediately after the war. She quietly emigrated to the United States in 1959, settling in California and living a simple life. It wasn't until 2006, decades after the war, that her past came to light. Authorities discovered her involvement in the atrocities at Ravensbrück and moved to deport her. Rinkel was stripped of her U.S. citizenship and deported to Germany. However, she never stood trial for her actions. She lived the rest of her life away from the public eye, but her name remains tied to the horrors of Ravensbrück. For those who survived, the fear of her dogs and her presence lingered as a painful memory. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.